Well, good morning. I seem to get a pretty good response to these pop tests. I figured I'd run you through a little 10-question ASE practice test today. And if you're ready, we'll jump into this thing. I don't think it's going to take us all that long. I'm going to give you the question. I'll give you just a second or two to think about it, see what you think your answer may be, and then I'll give you the answer slide right after that instead of stacking them at the end. And this one here, a thermostat is rated at 195 degrees Fahrenheit. Is that when it begins to open? Is that when it's fully open? Is that the radiator temperature when it's full warm? Or is that the fan full speed temperature? So if we see these numbers stamped on the bottom of these thermostat wax pellets, unless it's an electric thermostat, which actually is, the electric thermostat can open and close based on engine coolant, or it can open based whenever the heater that's built into it is warmed up by the PCM, and so that's a thing nowadays. But the answer to that is when it begins to open. Now, if you look at it, if you put one in some water and you heat it up with a thermometer in there, you can kind of see that if you got a good one. Now, I will say that there's this thing about testing thermostats, and if you're suspecting the thermostat is stuck closed, it's a good test to put it in boiling water, and or put it in water and bring the water up to a boil while you're testing the thermostat. To see if it'll ever open. That's a good test. But my Jeep was running too cold one time, and I decided I wanted to test the thermostat on it. And I put it in the water, and it opened at about 210 or something like that. But the fact remained that when I replaced the thermostat, the Jeep ran at higher operating temperature. It was running around 160 degrees before I replaced the thermostat. One time I was doing a preventative maintenance on a Crown Victoria that belonged to the college, and on those Crown Victoria engines you can change the thermostat in literally 3 minutes. I'm telling you, it's just so fast, as long as there's not a lot of pressure on the system. And I had one that was sitting there idling while I was checking everything, and I always like to plug in the wireless vehicle interface, which I had back then, made by Diagnostics, and it would pull the temperature of the vehicle up on the screen. I'd put that on there in big yellow letters where I could just glance over there and watch while the whole time I was working on it. That Crown Victoria never got over 160 degrees. I mean, it was just running stone cold. I had a thermostat in stock for it. Pull the thermostat housing off, switch the engine off, pull the thermostat housing off, had a thermostat and an O-ring, no gasket to scrape, dropped the thermostat in there, dropped the O-ring in there, put it back together, cranked it up, and within a minute and a half it went up to 195. I didn't figure it would be that fast in its reaction, but it was, and I thought that was very interesting. Question 2. Joe puts his car in neutral while coasting down a mile-long hill in Arizona. He will A. Save on gas, B. Use more gas, C. Heat the torque converter clutch, or D. Trigger a P1270 code. The answer is he'll use more gas, and there's your code that's typed into the engine controller or thereabouts. They will tell you that when you are coasting, when you let off the gas, if the pulse width drops below about 1.2 milliseconds and the engine speed's greater than 1200 RPM and you've let off the gas, turns the injectors off. It doesn't need to put fuel in there when you're coasting like that. And so then whenever all of those conditions aren't met anymore, it comes back up. If they open the throttle or the pulse width increases for whatever reason, or the engine speed drops below 1200, it'll turn the injectors back on. But if you're coasting down a mile-long hill, and some in Arizona, you're going to see mile-long hills, especially if you're going south from Phoenix down toward Tucson. If you put your vehicle in neutral, it's going to burn more gas in neutral than it would if you just let it coast. Of course, you need to make sure that you don't let it get out of. Also, having it in neutral, you don't get any engine braking that way. So there's multiple reasons to leave it in gear. All right. Now, question 3: a spark plug suddenly stops firing while the engine's at highway cruise. The ECM/PCM will instantly interpret this as A, a rich exhaust, B, a lean exhaust, C, an evap leak, or D, a quad driver fail. The answer is a lean exhaust, and the reason it's a lean exhaust is the oxygen sensor doesn't smell fuel. All it's looking for is oxygen, and when you've got unburned oxygen leaving that cylinder because there was no combustion event, it's going to see that oxygen. And you know, a lot of mechanics that don't think about that, if you ask them this question, they'll say, oh, it's going to read rich because it's going to see all that gas. Well, the O2 sensor doesn't see gas. All it sees is the lean exhaust. I know that a change different one on the old titanium oxygen sensors they had on the 87 to 90 model Jeep Cherokee 4 liters. Those actually had a 0 to 5 volt, which was an upside down thing because 5 volts was lean and 0 volts was rich, because it was measuring the temperature of the exhaust with that sensor. So that wouldn't apply to that one, although you're probably not going to be working on any of those this week anyway. Question 4. The header pipe has developed a crack/leak between the O2 sensor and the engine. This will immediately drive lambda readings low, lock the lambda at 1.0, or drive lambda readings high, or set a downstream O2 code. The answer is it'll drive the readings high. Now when the O2 readings are balanced, it reads 1.0. If the mixture contains too much oxygen, the lambda will read greater than 1.0. You know, think about that. It's basically adding fuel. If the mixture contains too little O2, it will be less than 1.0. It's subtracting fuel. But remember, as you think about it, this particular situation we're describing here is a, let me see if I can turn on my little laser there. It's fighting me. Anyway, wonder what that's doing. It just flashes my laser right quick. But anyway, there it is. This is a false lean condition. It's not an actual lean condition. It's a false lean condition. Well, what will that do? Well, it's going to cause the fuel trims to go crazy because it's not going to be telling the truth. Anything that's not telling the truth will cause the fuel trims to go crazy, okay? Question 5. An EGR valve suddenly sticks partially open when commanded closed. This will cause A, the O2 to show a lean mixture, B, the O2 to show a rich mixture, C, manifold pressure to drop, or a P0401 code to be stored. Okay, now this is a sort of a trick question here when you think about this, so we'll talk about this a little more. It's going to make it show a rich mixture. Early feedback mechanism in the GM cars, whenever the engine controller told it to open the EGR valve, it would look for the oxygen sensor to drift in the rich direction. That would be saying you're displacing some of the oxygen in the exhaust, and so the oxygen sensor is going to reflect that, and that's the way GM did that. Now, when you're talking about manifold pressure, that's the opposite of manifold vacuum. I've got a question a little bit later about that, so keep that in mind. A lot of the time on your scan tools nowadays, you'll see that it's reading manifold pressure and manifold vacuum as two separate readings. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. Question number 6. Let's see that little engine running. A lean air fuel mixture burns A, cold and fast, B, hot and fast, C, hot and slow, or D, cold and slow. Well, it actually burns hot and fast. It will, because of the fact that most of these things are running as lean as they are, you're going to see a lot of times snowy white spark plug ceramics, because it's running the spark plugs nice and warm. On some of the old the Ford pickup trucks, I guess Ford was sneaking around trying to get fuel economy up on some of their pickups. When you were just cruising down the highway, it would drop into something called lean cruise mode. And if you were watching the oxygen sensor, you'd see the oxygen sensor drop down to a real low level, and it would just stay down there. And occasionally, it would to make sure the oxygen sensor was still working, it would come out of that. And there was some of those trucks, like in the real early 90s, 92, 93, whatever. The strategy was when it came out of lean cruise mode to make sure everything was working okay. If you were going through a certain throttle angle and EGR was doing a certain thing, it would literally feel like somebody had run into the back of the pickup. Like they do all those movies, whenever those stupid movies where people go wham and they ram the back of the car when they're chasing you, which is pretty dumb. I don't know why they do that. Anyway, it would feel like somebody did that. And I worked on one of those and I took the vehicle analyzer that would plug in between the engine controllers as part of the SBDS, big old box you put in the seat. and you could record and then upload that to Ford. And it was a dial-up connection. It was really slow. That was before all this high-speed internet. But anyway, when the guy got it and he looked at it, because I managed to get it to do it, I could play with it and get it to go boom and do that whenever I was cruising down the highway on a pretty long test drive. He said, "You'll never fix that." He said, "That's programmed in there, and when it does that," he said, "you're never going to know, you're never going to be able to fix that." And there was another dealer that had worked on that truck trying to fix that same problem, and they had changed everything except the hood of the truck trying to fix it, and it still did it. And so without rather having to go into all that trouble and try to work on it and fix something that was designed into it, I just told the customer, I said, "This is something they haven't issued a program or a different engine controller or nothing on it because not enough people are complaining about it. You had to drive it a certain way to get it to do that." And there was only a couple of those trucks that I saw doing that, customers talking about it. Question 7. A pre-electronic throttle control engine has an IAC reading of 2% at idle. One possible cause might be maybe a vacuum leak, IAC stuck closed, engine running rich, throttle body dirty. Well, what do you think? That's going to be possibly a vacuum leak, because if the vacuum leak is, something that's common to all the cylinders, instead of being right there at one injector, it can make it idle higher. And that's one of the things that will cause the RPM to be in the dead band. The PCM's adaptive strategy will reduce IAC action. Now, there was a guy that I worked with named Mark Smith. That's a generic name, isn't it? And he was over there, and he was getting into a little bit of drivability work, and I was the primary drivability guy. And he was a funny guy anyway. He was a guy that, wouldn't change the radio station, so I raised the door. You might remember that story. But he came over there, and he goes, "I'm trying to get this Ranger straightened out over here." And apparently somebody had been turning the screw and changing the idle stop setting, and they had it in the dead band, and it wasn't using the idle air control. And he says, "How do I get this back like it's supposed to be?" And I said, "First thing you're going to do is you're going to take the battery cable off, and then you're going to wash the throttle body out really good, clean all that out of there, and then you're going to put the battery cable back on it. You're going to disconnect the idle air control. You're going to crank it up. And this is with a warm engine." I said, "You're going to adjust it till it's hovering right about 500 to 550 RPM. You don't want it so tight that the throttle plate sticks in the bore, but just above that threshold. And then you plug it back in and let it learn, and it will come back online." And so he went over there. He actually wrote all that stuff down. He went over there and did what I told him to, and he came back. And he says, "Hey, that worked really good. You must have seen this before." And I said, "Nope, never have. It's the first time I've ever heard it." And he grabs me by the throat. Ah! Anyway, actually, I had done a bunch of those that way, I set it back like it was supposed to be. Question 8. As engine load increases, what happens? A. Manifold pressure increases. B. Manifold vacuum increases. C. Ignition timing advances. Or D. Injector pulse is reduced. Well, the answer to that is manifold pressure increases. Okay, so let's talk about that for a minute. You start out with barometric pressure of, let's say, 29 inches of mercury, and at idle, your manifold pressure is going to be low, your manifold vacuum is going to be high. But when you put it in a load, pressure goes up and vacuum goes down. But they always are going to equal 29 inches. See, that's just the way that works. And I saw that needle drop over there. That was whenever you're giving it the gas, it's going to go down. Now let's say that you are sitting here. If you want to illustrate what a bad catalytic converter looks like, and you're teaching some young guy, all right, lock the park brake really good, chock the wheels, put it in gear. Usually I put it in reverse, so if it does take off, it won't run into anything, like a toolbox or somebody standing in front of the car or whatever. Make sure there's nothing behind you and the door's open. So you give it some gas with it in gear and brake torque it, and as long as that thing's loaded, this needle's going to stay down here, right in this area somewhere. When it's idling, it's going to be up here. 18 to 22 is, the green range. All right, idling without it being loaded. You put it in gear, it's going to drop down to about right here, and whenever you load it. But if it's not in gear, and you rev the engine up, and it doesn't come down and recover real quick after you rev it up and hold the throttle up, then you've got exhaust issues typically. Now, low engine vacuum can also be caused by EGR flow. And it can also, EGR, uncommanded EGR flow with the engine idling. It can also be caused by late ignition timing. It can be caused by late valve timing. So learn your vacuum stuff. It's important. Question 9. An engine has good fuel pressure, good strong spark, clean dry spark plugs, and good compression, but won't start unless you remove any 2 of the 6 spark plugs. I've seen this, and it bumfuddled a friend of mine that was working next door, and he was telling me, he said, this thing's got everything it needs. He was a good mechanic. He knew how to find out why one wouldn't start. The answer was, you got a clogged exhaust. That's what I told him. It sounded like a machine gun when he started it up. But it fired up, and it wouldn't start before he pulled 2 of the plugs out and tried to start it that way. All right, now question 10. A rounded off exhaust cam lobe will cause A, a burn valve, C, B, exhaust backfire, C, induction backfire, or D, a clogged converter. All right, you've seen that before. Exhaust backfire is typically where you're going to well, it depends. Actually, I put that answer is not even right, and I messed up. Induction backfire is what it's going to cause, not exhaust backfire. I can't believe that I put that as the answer. That was dumb. I made a mistake, and here it is right in front of everybody to see. Induction backfire is the deal. So that's what your problem's going to be. If you got one that's going boop, 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 popping like a machine gun out the carburetor or the intake or something like that, look for a rounded off exhaust cam lobe. Because of the fact that it gets air in there and it lights off, has a combustion event, but the exhaust is not open, exhaust valve is not open enough to let that out of there, so all of that has got to come back into the intake. And if it's bad enough, it can actually bust the intake manifold, if it's plastic or some of that thin aluminum, something like that. Excuse me for getting my own question wrong. That way, see, I didn't even make a perfect score on my own test. That's really silly whenever you can't see the forest for the trees. Anyway, we've been here about 16 minutes. Induction backfire is the right answer to this one, not exhaust backfire. I was, messed up. All right, so here we go. I was going to show you this driving with a flat spare, and I took this picture myself sitting behind a vehicle at a traffic light a couple of years ago. It's a bad bet to drive with a flat spare. It just is, because if you have a flat tire, you're in a pickle. However, Teslas don't come with a spare tire. A lot of other cars don't come with a spare tire. And there aren't very many people out there anymore that can change a tire. I don't know if you've ever noticed that or not. There was this girl one time that came down there to the college, and it was Friday morning. She worked in the front office. She was like 27 years old. She said, can you look my little Mazda over and tell me if there's anything wrong, because I'm going on a trip? And I said, sure. I looked it over real good. And then I asked her, I said, do you know how to change a tire on this car? She said, no, I never even thought about that. I says, do you want to change a tire here in this flat service bay where it's a safe place to be and I can help you if you get in trouble? She goes, yeah. So I showed her where the jack was, showed her where the lug wrench was, told her how to break the lugs loose without jacking the car up so that it, the wheel wouldn't turn. So she did that. She raised the car up. She pulled the tire off. She put the spare on. She dismounted the spare, got it out from where it was or whatever. She did that all by herself. She struggled, but she made it happen. And so she said, well, now I know what to do if I have a flat. I said, make sure you're on a level place. Don't let, don't be on a slant or something like that where it's going to fall off the jack and hurt you. But she knew how to use the jack. She knew how to use the lug wrench. She knew how to do it all. So the next time I saw her, she came and said, my dad told me how much he appreciated you teaching me this, because he had never thought to teach me how to change a tire, and he thought it was the grandest thing in the world that now she knew how to change a tire on her own car. But everybody needs to know how to change a tire, unless you got a lug nut that's super, super, super hard to get off there, you can usually make it happen. I carry a 20-volt DeWalt impact wrench and a set of lug sockets in the back of my truck, so that I can change a tire for somebody or change a tire for myself without having to piddle with a lug wrench. I've also got a electric over hydraulic 5-ton jack that's 12 volts, raise it up, made by Betro. You can buy that kit for, I think, about $100 on Amazon. Anyway, we're coming up on 20 minutes. I appreciate you guys coming by, And I'll talk to you next week with another part 2 of this A8 practice test stuff. So be ready for that. Let me know how you did on this one. Share the video. Make a comment. See you next week.